Part 1. Real Errors in Judgment. Chapter 1. Mr. Phillips drummed his fingers on the desktop. His hands went to his cravat to see if it was tied properly. He briefly wished he had a mirror in his office, even if he'd rarely employ it. He moved his inkwell closer to the centre of the desk. Once, 30 years ago, he'd accidentally knocked his inkwell off his desk when waiting for a particularly tense meeting. Since then, he didn't like it to be near the edge. Pulling his attention from the inkwell, he straightened his blotting pad for the second time since telling his assistant, Mr. Whitestone, to show in Mr. Wickham. He set his fingers drumming once more. A light knock sounded. Mr. Phillips brought his hands together on the desktop, clasping them with deliberate lightness. He did not care for Mr. Wickham, nor for what must be done. Still, the thing must be done, and he was the one who must do it. Working to ease the tension in his jaw, he called, "Come in." The door creaked open. Mr. Phillips winced. He should remember to have Mr. Whitestone oil the hinges. The young man gestured Mr. Wickham inside, then backed out. He pulled the door closed with another creak. Mr. Phillips offered Mr. Wickham a nod, but didn't stand. Wickham sauntered across the room, expression affable. He stopped before the desk and offered an answering dip of his head, deep enough to be nearly a bow. His smile, when he raised his chin, was likely meant to be winning. Mr. Phillips had been an attorney for too many years to be moved by a show of even teeth. A handsome face and a pleasant smile did not guarantee a good person. Mr. Phillips was just sorry he hadn't applied that knowledge sooner. "Sit down, Mr. Wickham." Mr. Phillips made an effort to sound genial. "A glass of port?" "No, thank you." Mr. Wickham took the chair opposite Mr. Phillips, giving every appearance of casual self-assurance. "I think you know why I'm here." And why shouldn't Wickham be assured? He knew Mr. Phillips had few options left for his niece. "Lydia said to expect you." Wickham's grin grew. "She's a good girl." "I'm relieved you think so, as you've asked for her hand." Mr. Phillips had to work to keep back the rise of bile in his throat. "I did, true," Wickham drawled. "Still, before I commit to marriage to Miss Lydia Bennet just yet, I must know the financial situation." Mr. Phillips raised his eyebrows. "I rather thought your proposal and Lydia's rather public display over it were a commitment." Wickham sputtered a denial, half rising. Annoyance sparking in him, Mr. Phillips held up a staying hand. "Regardless, I will give you the information." Mr. Wickham settled back in the chair, his smug look returning. He nodded for Mr. Phillips to continue. "In a nutshell, Lydia will have £500 a year, paid quarterly." Phillips took in the avaricious gleam in Wickham's eyes and couldn't help a touch of smugness of his own as he continued. "But the principal can't be touched. The money is to be paid to her. As her husband, you have the right to take it from her, but the payments are set up so that she must receive the money first." Wickham's wide lips pulled down in a frown. He opened his mouth to speak, but Mr. Phillips continued. "On her death, the principal and payments will be divided equally between any children she has, and the principal will still remain beyond reach. While they are minors, the payments will go to their legal guardian, presumably you." Wickham scowled. "What if she doesn't produce any brats at all?" "If she dies without issue, both the capital and stipend will be equally divided between her surviving sisters." Containing a grin at Wickham's obvious dismay, Mr. Phillips leaned back in his chair and waited for Mr. Wickham's next question. "Lydia told me there was more money," Wickham snapped. Well, that wasn't exactly a question, but it served. "There is, but the remainder of the money is mine to control." Mr. Phillips took mild pleasure in the anger that flashed in Wickham's eyes. "And as I don't want my ward's husband to end up in debtor's prison, I have taken the liberty of ascertaining the amounts of your debts to Meryton merchants. Those debts will be paid." "With her principal?" Wickham demanded, sitting forward in his chair, eyes flashing. "That's all but criminal. I'll bring a suit." Mr. Phillips held up a staying hand once more. "Via the interest. It is my estimate that you will begin receiving the additional money after 2 quarters. He gave a sad shake of his head, affecting acute disappointment. You haven't been in Meryton even 2 months. I don't see how you could have run up so much debt in that time. Wickham brought a fist down on the desktop, causing the inkwell to jump. You have no right to keep that money from me. I have no right to give it to you at any time, Mr. Phillips snapped, unintimidated. If Lydia chooses not to marry you, I will be happy to reinvest it for her benefit. Mark me well, I shall in no way press her to accept your suit, no matter how you've compromised her. That set Wickham back in his chair again. He glowered at Mr. Phillips for a long moment. Finally, he forced an almost amiable smile. She'll marry me. Mr. Phillips nodded. I agree. She's besotted. She'll also agree that I should have the money, which is why I am her guardian and why I have the making of that decision. Wickham glared at him. Mr. Phillips returned the look calmly, waiting until Wickham dropped his gaze. Don't get upset about the money. When your legal debts are paid, you will start receiving the funds. Still, you have no right to withhold it, Wickham muttered, gaze on the floor. The man was a child, Mr. Phillips realised sadly. Marriage to a man like Mr. Wickham was precisely the sort of thing he was supposed to prevent, but in spite of his bold words, he truly had little choice now. I have every right, and have the legal documents to prove it. Mr. Phillips had made sure he had considerable control of his niece's money. He would never take a farthing for himself, but he wanted to be certain that no one else could do so either. By the way, I am not touching your gambling debts. Wickham's head snapped up. Debts of honour should be paid. Then pay them, Mr. Phillips shrugged. Give me the money too. Absolutely not. Mr. Phillips' refusal instigated another staring match. Again, Wickham dropped his gaze. It was a wonder the man began such competitions. A conscience as heavy as his could never hope to prevail. A debt is a debt, Wickham groused as he resumed contemplation of his shoes. Gambling debts are not legally enforceable, which means the only thing that will make you pay them is that you won't be given credit unless you do, Mr. Phillips stated. Frankly, I will be made glad if no one in Meryton is willing to gamble with you. He wondered what Mr. Wickham's reaction would be when he discovered none of the merchants of Meryton would extend him any additional credit. Mr. Phillips had made it plain that while he wished Lydia's union to begin with a clean slate, he didn't want his ward's husband to accrue more debt. He would not pay any debt acquired in the future. Face folded into troubled lines, Mr. Wickham stared at Mr. Phillips. We will need more money. Miss Mary is marrying well, and Lydia's other 3 sisters are sure to attract wealthy suitors. More could be given to Lydia. You should be glad to pay a little more to get her off your hands, especially under the circumstances. I will not cheat my other wards for Lydia's benefit. You are free to refuse to marry her. There will be no breach of promise lawsuit, since you have no assets. Wickham looked ready to spit, which Mr. Phillips hoped he would not, finding the habit disgusting. He waited, fascinated despite himself at how easy it was to read Wickham's emotions, which was surprising because Wickham previously fooled him. The man's struggle to rein in his anger was readily apparent. I thought she would bring more money, Wickham finally grated out. Mr. Phillips shrugged with cultivated indifference. Perhaps Wickham's anger resulted from his having dug himself into a hole. If he repudiated the engagement, he would lose all credibility. Too many people witnessed him agree with Lydia when she said they were engaged. If he denied it, he would lose the respect the community had given him. He would also have trouble getting credit now, and must realise that. There is another way to get money, Mr. Phillips finally offered for Lydia's sake. I could use another clerk. I will pay you the same amount as I pay Mr. Whitestone, which is generous, considering your lack of experience. Wickham, who'd leaned forward eagerly at the mention of money, jerked backwards. A sneer curled his lips. Me? Work for you? With Whitestone? Mr. Phillips' smile was benign. Mary is engaged to him. A moment ago you said she is marrying well, so you must like what he earns." A third time he raised a hand to stay Mr. Wickham's words, knowing what they would be, but wanting to try. "The offer is not charity. I will let you go if you don't work. Don't worry, I won't make you work as hard as Mr. Whitestone, but almost as hard." Mr. Phillips waved his hand dismissively before dropping it back to the desk. "I don't expect immediate competence, but you can read and write, and I can train you. I have documents that need copying. I'll personally check to see that you do it neatly and correctly. I'll give you more interesting work after you prove your competence." Wickham stretched his legs out and smiled. "No." Mr. Phillips shrugged. He hadn't expected Wickham to accept. "You won't take my offer of gainful employment, but you're determined to marry Lydia." "I am. Can we post the banns immediately?" "Certainly." Before either party changed their minds and Mr. Phillips was left with a compromised, possibly with child, definitely willful, young woman on his hands. "Now, may I interest you in a glass of port?" "Certainly." Wickham's tone mockingly mimicked Mr. Phillips of moments ago. Ignoring the barb, Mr. Phillips opened a drawer and pulled out 2 glasses and a bottle of port. He poured a little into each glass, then pushed one across the desk to Wickham. They clicked glasses and drank without saying a word. If anyone saw them, they would assume the 2 men drank in celebration. Mr. Phillips didn't think either of them did, though. It was a measure of Mr. Wickham's desperation that he was marrying someone who wasn't worth more than Lydia. It was a measure of Mr. Phillips' desperation that he was allowing it. Wickham drained his glass in one gulp. He smacked the empty tumbler down on the desktop. "May I assume you'll have any relevant papers drawn up?" Mr. Phillips nodded. "You may. And may I assume you shall sign them?" Wickham shrugged. "So long as they say what you just told me, I suppose I will." He stood, a grin overtaking his features once more. "I'll go share the good news with Lydia." Mr. Phillips nodded, keeping his expression blank. He set his glass down and stood, following the other man to the door, which he opened. "Good day." "Good day." Mr. Wickham strode past Mr. Whitestone without a glance, whistling as he left the office. "I'll call if I need anything," Mr. Phillips said to Whitestone. "Yes, sir," his clerk replied. Closing himself in his office, Mr. Phillips returned to his desk. He poured a second, much larger glass of port. Anything to rinse away the sour taste Wickham left in his mouth. As much as he knew his niece was smitten with the man, Mr. Phillips couldn't help but feel he'd failed as a guardian. His first mistake was in letting Lydia come out. Only 15, she was much too young. True, her mother would have wanted it, but that was no excuse. The 5 Bennet girls were his responsibility, and he should have known better. He sighed and took another sip of port. He'd been tired, though, so tired. Tired of arguing. Tired of conflict and strain. Of what seemed like endless sorrow. When the period of mourning for his wife ended, he'd been eager for his nieces to have the ability to get some enjoyment out of life. They'd spent almost 3 years in households dominated by illness and grief, first for their mother, then their father, and finally for their aunt. Keeping Lydia at home had only added strife to that sadness. Letting her come out had been a boon of laughter and joy. It wasn't until after he allowed Lydia to join her 4 older sisters as an adult that he realised the burden on her was the least. The restrictions on the older girls, especially Jane as eldest and Elizabeth as second eldest, had been the cruellest. They'd been limited in their ability to move in society in the precise years they should have spent finding husbands. Lydia had never experienced that. The family's prolonged period of illnesses and mourning had come when she was still a child. Still, no harm would have come of his decision to permit Lydia out if not for Mr. Wickham. He poured another fingerful of port, dismayed he'd ever cared for the man, ever welcomed him into their home. Fool that he'd been, he'd repeatedly invited Mr. Wickham, enthralled by his easy manner and charm, the liveliness he'd added to a home so long kept quiet in mourning. Then, 2 nights ago, Mr. Wickham had revealed what sort of man he truly was. The household had retired for the evening. It had been a calculated decision on Mr. Phillips' part to put Jane with Mary in one of the small rooms on the same floor as his, and Elizabeth with Kitty in the other. In that way, he hoped to effect improvement in all 5 girls. Lydia, being the youngest and wilfully social, was relegated to a tiny servant's room above him. It gave him a sense of security to know she had several flights of steps between her and freedom. As it turned out, his sense of security was misplaced. The night Mary and Mr. Whitestone announced their engagement, Mr. Phillips woke to sounds that should not be coming from the bedroom of a 15-year-old girl. He hadn't moved for a long, stunned moment. Then he'd sat bolt upright in bed, horrified. He jumped from bed and scrambled to dress. Whoever was with Lydia, and he had his suspicions, he didn't want to confront them in his nightclothes. He was yanking on his shirt when he heard the telltale creak of the 5th stair, leading up, or in this case down, from the attic. He'd gone still, unsure what to do. He looked down at his thin arms, his bony hands. What did he think he could do? If it was Mr. Wickham, and Lydia's interest in the man was so obvious it seemed unlikely to be any other, Mr. Phillips couldn't challenge him. To do so would be suicide. Even if he was brave enough, where would that leave his other 4 wards? If not Mr. Wickham, it was someone of a similar ilk. It was most likely Lydia had taken a soldier to her bed, and Mr. Phillips had never fenced or fired a pistol. Mr. Phillips slumped, defeated. Moments later, he heard the patter of Lydia's bare feet as she returned to her room. He'd sat a long time, thinking, knowing himself for a coward. Finally, near dawn, he'd risen and made ready for the day, intent on leaving for work before the girls woke. He couldn't encounter Elizabeth, who would see something was wrong, or Lydia, whom it would pain him to look on. Jane, Mary and Kitty would be nearly as bad, for he'd failed them all. Once awakened to the flaw in Mr. Wickham's character, Mr. Phillips had set out to learn more about him. What began as a tentative questioning of one merchant soon turned into a morning spent visiting every vendor in Meryton. He was not happy with what he learned. Nevertheless, later that day when Mr. Wickham and Lydia rather publicly announced they were engaged, Mr. Phillips had breathed a sigh of relief and assented. Now he sat alone in his office drinking too much port, an unusual occupation for him, and reflecting that there were many things he could have done better. He could only hope he'd protected her finances well enough, and that Wickham would treat her at least passing well. Mr. Phillips raised his glass and took a final sip, reflecting that he could also hope, for the sake of his other wards, that he could indeed do better. Chapter 2. Mary's error, Mr. Phillips reflected as he watched the ceremonies take place several weeks later, was in setting the date for her wedding before Lydia had set one. As Mary and Mr. Whitestone had become engaged before Lydia and Mr. Wickham, doing so made sense. That was, if one didn't take into account Lydia's boundless need to be the centre of attention, which of course forced her to insist on sharing Mary's wedding date. Sharing might work for some sisters, but Lydia simply couldn't let the opportunity to overshadow one of hers pass. It was in her nature to torment in this way. In fact, the more he thought on Lydia's actions the night Mary announced her engagement, the more Mr. Phillips realised he should have anticipated them. Now, watching Mary suffer through a joint ceremony, in which the superficially stunning couple Lydia and Wickham made completely overshadowed her and Mr. Whitestone, Mr. Phillips felt sorry for his middle niece. What should be a happy day was turned into just another time in Mary's life when little notice was taken of her. Hopefully she took solace, as he did, in the knowledge that immediately following the wedding breakfast, the Wickhams were departing for London. He also took solace in knowing that Mary and her husband would be living a short walk from him. He resolved to tell her as much at the first opportunity. Sadly, one didn't arise while at church. As they set out toward home and the joint wedding breakfast, Mr. Phillips resolved to keep his sentiment in mind. Soon it became obvious that Jane, Elizabeth and Kitty were also determined to show Mary that she mattered every bit as much as Lydia. When the Wickhams made a show of striking out ahead, waving to every passer-by they knew, his other nieces fell back to walk with Mary and Mr. Whitestone. "Do keep up!" Lydia called back to her sisters when they neared home, she and Wickham striding ahead on long legs. "We have to have my wedding breakfast quickly. George and I don't want to miss the coach." "Nor do we wish you to," Elizabeth whispered somewhere behind Mr. Phillips. Kitty, who walked arm in arm with her, giggled. Mr. Phillips kept his face bland as he hurried along, head bowed slightly against a blustery wind that seemed not to affect the youngsters at all. "Her wedding breakfast," Mary muttered. "As if I'm not here." "It's your wedding breakfast too," Jane said firmly, where she walked in line with Mary and her husband. "I asked Cook to save most of the cakes and the hot chocolate until she's gone," Kitty added in a low voice. Mr. Phillips couldn't condone that, but as he wasn't meant to overhear, and eavesdropping was rude, he decided there was little to do about it except make sure he didn't grin. "Kitty, that's so good of you," Mary whispered back. "Hot chocolate is Mr. Whitestone's favourite, isn't it, Mr. Whitestone?" "It is," Mr. Whitestone replied staunchly. "She would only hog it all anyways," Kitty said. "She would play hostess and pour, but only so she can have most of the chocolate and make ours all milk." "Undoubtedly." Elizabeth's murmured agreement sparkled with amusement. Ahead of them, Lydia reached Mr. Phillips' home and swept inside. Mr. Phillips slowed his pace to match his other nieces. He had no need to enjoy the Wickhams' company alone. "Do hurry up. I want to show you all where you must sit now that I'm married," Lydia's voice said, coming from above. Mr. Phillips looked up to see she'd opened the parlour window, in spite of the cold, and stuck her head out. She let out a squeal and a giggle and ducked back inside. "George, don't pinch me there! You're so naughty!" Mr. Phillips suppressed a grimace as the words echoed down into the street. The girl had no sense of decorum. He only hoped Wickham wouldn't tire of her antics too quickly. "Naughty is one word for it," Elizabeth pointed out in clipped tones. "Hush, it's her wedding day as well," Jane admonished. "And we won't need to put up with her much longer," Kitty added. Mr. Phillips turned and cast them a quelling look. Lydia was difficult enough when in a pleasant mood, so there was no reason to spoil the one she was in now. Besides which, her poor behaviour didn't excuse his other nieces to have bad manners. "Up you go to celebrate with your sister. I wish to speak to Mary and Mr. Whitestone for a moment. And do close that window once you're up there." "Yes, Uncle," they chorused. To his surprise, first Elizabeth, then Kitty and Jane, gave him a kiss on the cheek as they passed. Mary took on a slightly worried look, turning to him expectantly. "Is something wrong?" Mr. Phillips smiled. "Nothing of the kind, dear. I simply wish to tell you both how happy your union makes me, and how pleased I am you'll be nearby. It warms my heart to know that, no matter what happens with your sisters, I'll always have you, Mary, and you, Jonathan." A smile brightened Mary's face. She threw her arms about his neck. "Thank you, Uncle Phillips, and thank you for taking such good care of us." He patted her on the back, not sure he deserved such praise. "Yes, well, I'm doing my best." Mary stepped away, and Mr. Whitestone shook his hand. "Thank you, sir." "Yes, well," Mr. Phillips repeated. Embarrassed, he cleared his throat. "We'd best join the others." A smile on his face, he turned and led the way inside and up to the breakfast parlour. 3 days later found Mr. Phillips returned to his office as usual. He'd given Mr. Whitestone the week off to spend with his new bride, and therefore had his office door open so he could see anyone who came in. He was unsurprised when footsteps without resolved into the tall form of Colonel Forster, head of the Meryton militia and Wickham's superior officer. While not looking forward to the visit, Mr. Phillips had been expecting it ever since sorting through his mail that morning. Wickham had left a letter saying that his trip to London wasn't simply a week alone with his new bride. He was resigning his commission and wouldn't be returning to Meryton. Coward that Wickham was, Mr. Phillips was certain he would have left a similar note for his superior, rather than admitting to his resignation in person. He'd likely celebrated his union with his comrades, accepted drinks and gifts, all the while planning to disappear the moment he was actually wed. The colonel, resplendent in his red uniform, looked about the empty front office. Mr. Phillips cleared his throat. Colonel Forster turned his way. "May I help you, Colonel?" Mr. Phillips called. A frown on his handsome face, Forster made his ponderous way into the back office. The space seemed to shrink with the tall officer in it. "You may, sir." Mr. Phillips nodded and gestured to the chair across from him. Colonel Forster took it. That seat, Mr. Phillips reflected, fitted many a rear. "Colonel, how may I assist you today?" Colonel Forster cleared his throat. A glower settled over his features. "I received Mr. Wickham's letter of resignation from the militia. Did you know about it?" In the grate the logs shifted, letting out a rustle of sound and a puff of sparks. "I suspected as much," Mr. Phillips admitted. "You didn't tell me." "I didn't think it was my business to tell you." Forster cleared his throat again, shifting in the chair. "Your business comes in the form of Mr. Wickham's IOUs, owed to many of my officers. They were under the impression he would pay them when he married your niece." Mr. Phillips resisted the urge to sigh. "That is between your officers and your former officer." Indignation covered Forster's face. "But I've discovered you are paying Mr. Wickham's debts in Meryton." "I am using money that would otherwise go to his wife to pay off debts that could put him in debtor's prison," Mr. Phillips said crisply. There was no point in concealing his motivation. Colonel Forster leaned back in his chair, expression contemplative. "And debts of honour are not legally enforceable," he ventured after a long moment. "Correct." At least the man was intelligent. Mr. Phillips only hoped he was also reasonable. Colonel Forster leaned forward again, expression beseeching. "Don't you feel honour-bound to cover his debts?" Mr. Phillips shook his head. He wondered if he'd been wise to let Mr. Whitestone take the day off. Mr. Phillips was not a young or intimidating man. Mr. Whitestone was much more upright. "On the contrary, my fiduciary responsibility to my niece demands that I only pay her husband's legal debts, and none other." A glower pulled the lines on Colonel Forster's face downward, removing any amiability from his expression. "Look, Phillips, everyone knows the girls are heiresses. Their parents are dead. The estate sold. You have the money to pay off Wickham's debts to my men. And yet, I have no legal obligation to do so, and will not," Mr. Phillips said as firmly as he could. "I see," Colonel Forster said tightly. "You will not be popular with my officers." As if he ever had been. Well, they accepted his invitations, but he had no illusions it was because of him. Free food and wine and congenial young people both from his household and the neighbours in Meryton had been the incentive. "You believe I should ignore my responsibility to my niece to be popular with men who will be gone in May?" Mr. Phillips forced a chuckle, as if unintimidated by the large, red-coated man across from him. "Why should I?" "To restore Mr. Wickham's reputation." This time Mr. Phillips' chuckle was more heartfelt. "I don't want to restore his reputation." Colonel Forster's eyebrows shot up. "I don't want anyone to accept his IOUs," Mr. Phillips continued. "I want him to live within his income." "Good luck with that," Colonel Forster barked, coming to his feet. "And good day, sir." Colonel Forster stomped from the room, the staccato of his boot heels drowning out Mr. Phillips' murmured goodbye. He slammed Mr. Phillips' door behind him as he left. A moment later, Mr. Phillips winced, hearing the outer door slam as well. With a sigh, he crossed to his office door and pushed it back open to the creak of the hinges. He really ought to have Mr. Whitestone oil it, he reflected as he returned to his desk. Mr. Phillips settled into his chair and brought out work that needed his attention. He neatened the short stack of pages. He pulled the inkwell nearer. He glanced once more at the closed outer door. A slight smile turned up the edges of his mouth. Mr. Phillips wondered just how much Mr. Wickham owed Colonel Forster.